Codemotion.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. We were just trying to get my ludicrous comedy sound effects working for the talk, but never mind. You're just going to have non-ludicrous comedy sound effects. I'll just have to make them myself. So I'm Chris Mills, and thank you for all turning out today. I've got quite a lot to cover, so I'm going to be talking today about a load of interesting responsive design techniques and some ideas for supporting older browsers. A little bit about me, first of all. I work for Opera Software, and I also work for the W3C, doing lots of messing about with nascent standards, telling the spec teams, you know, this one seems like a good idea, or this one seems to be really badly written, you must have been smoking something at the time. Telling them lots of feedback generally on how to improve the standards. I do lots of HTML5 and CSS3 and JavaScript work. I also whinge a lot about accessibility all the time. I'm really into accessibility, so I try to work out how we can use all of this modern, new, shiny stuff, but still keep things accessible to people with disabilities on the web, because I think it's very important, and so should you. And then outside work, I'm a heavy metal drummer and a very proud father of 3 beautiful children, and the combination of that results in something like this. So before we go any further, here's a bunch of useful websites that you could visit. I publish a lot of articles at dev.opera.com and webplatform.org, the new W3C documentation site. So please visit there for lots of useful free articles about open standards stuff. I've also put this presentation up on slideshare.net/ChrisDavidMills, so don't feel that you have to write loads of notes down, because the stuff's already there for you to get hold of. And then I'm not sure if we'll have much time at the end for questions, because this is quite a long talk as it is, so note down my email address and my Twitter handle, and feel free to bug me later on if you have any questions, or just catch me in a bar somewhere, because I do spend quite a lot of time in those places. The idea of this talk really is that pretty much everybody has heard and understands the very basics of media queries and width-based responsive design stuff. And I just want to go a little bit further and look at some issues beyond that that don't tend to get looked at quite so much during talks. Also, as well as the media query stuff, I'll be looking at some other responsive modules, like things like Flexbox and multicol. I'll be looking at how we can add intelligent fallbacks for older browsers that don't support this stuff already using Modernizr. And I'll be looking at where we're going in the future with CSS4 media queries and other such interesting things. In effect, I just want to give your information a little power up. I don't know why, but this talk ended up being a ludicrous tribute to 80s video games. I have no idea why, but people enjoy 80s video games. So a quick flashback, first of all. I just want to give us a bit of context in how we got to where we are in terms of responsive web design stuff. In the beginning, a little bit after God created the earth, and a little bit further on, there wasn't really any responsive web design issues early on in the life of the web, because we only really had monitors and, well, we only really had desktop monitors and laptops to worry about. Okay, we did have this thing, WAP, but this was just terrible. Who here had to develop WAP applications? Anybody? Yeah, a few of you. You can remember what it's like, some of you guys. It was terrible. It was the most overrated thing since Dragon's Lair came out on video disc in the early 80s. Absolutely terrible. And then the mobile web arrived. It really was the mobile web. It actually was the web on mobile phones, rather than this horrible, dumbed-down, useless, neutered version of the web that we had to cope with WAP. And we had the web appearing on feature phones and smartphones and tablets and all these kind of things, and that was cool, but of course this brought with it a lot more problems. One of the first technologies that we really had to try and solve some of these responsive design problems was media types. And there's the obvious ones that you tend to use every day, like media screen and media print, if you want to provide a better style sheet just for when you print your page or application out. They're great ideas. And then there's these ones as well, which some of you may have had a look at. There's also a lot of other really weird ones that nobody has ever used, such as TTY and Braille and things like that. But They just haven't been used at all particularly. And initially, media handheld seemed like a good idea because people looked at it and they said, well, oh, this is a great idea. You know, we can just get this CSS and apply it to handheld devices. But of course, this is a stupid idea because what is a handheld device exactly? It's really just screen, but loads of different screen sizes, isn't it? So it's a completely flawed idea. Back in the early days when media handheld first appeared, the mobile browser manufacturers all jumped on it and said, this is a great idea. So a lot of them made it so that when handheld media was available in the website, it would use that by default. But it was a terrible idea, really, because all of the web developers kind of used it as an excuse just to serve a really rubbish, dumbed-down version of the page to mobile phones, and the users were unhappy, and it very quickly started to get ignored again. Media TV also seems like a good idea when you first think about it, because now we've got all of these web-enabled TVs appearing. So it's like, yay, we can just send this CSS just to TVs to create optimized layouts. But again, it's a terrible idea, because really a TV is just another type of screen, isn't it? While we're on the subject of TV, I can't say too many bad things about web TV because, well, one of my employers makes quite a lot of money making TV browsers and things. But at the moment, I don't think we're really using web TV to the best of its abilities. You know, if you think about it, we could have amazing interactive experiences where you can maybe be watching a program and get more information on the clothes the people are wearing or the place that they are, et cetera, et cetera. It could be really interesting and interactive, but first of all, the processing power in web TVs is rubbish, so it would just not support such interactivity. And also, the manufacturers seem to be kind of obsessed with just giving you Facebook and Google talk and Twitter on television, which again is a terrible idea. There was a survey done a while ago of like thousands of teenagers, and they all concluded that they'd be absolutely horrified doing their social networking in huge letters on the wall where their whole family can see exactly what they're doing in the living room. It's a really bad idea. I think really we need to revisit web TV and improve things a great deal. At the moment, it's terrible. But of course, what I think and what you think doesn't really matter, does it? What really matters is what your clients and your bosses think, because a lot of those guys are going, we want a TV app because it's really hot at the moment. So, you know, our jobs depend on giving them what they want. So I'd give you the advice in general that if you have to make a TV optimized application, it's pretty much the same kind of, especially in terms of layout optimization, it's pretty much the same principles as when you're making an optimized layout for a mobile device. If you consider that a TV has a very large screen, but it's very low resolution and it's across the other side of the room, whereas a mobile phone has a very small, very high resolution screen and it's about a foot away from your face. So it's quite similar really in a lot of ways. Anyway, let's go back to the modern world. This is the only representation I could find of the modern world. I'm not sure how accurate it is. This talk went down particularly badly in America, I have to say. Let's just very quickly go through these basic things that most of us already know, but just to make sure. I think most of us are comfortable with the idea of media queries. These have succeeded where media types in general failed because they allow us to apply CSS to pages in a more granular way. So we're basically saying, you know, for a large screen, apply this layout. For a narrow screen, apply a narrow screen layout that's optimized for that size of screen. So that's pretty cool. And it allows you to do stuff like this. I'm not a designer, you might notice. But then, of course, we've got this mobile problem. Mobile browsers tend to lie. When a mobile browser renders a web page, it won't render it at its true screen width. Instead, it says, oh, I'll render it at about 1,000 pixels, and then I'll shrink the result down to fit the screen. And of course, this is a good defensive design strategy by mobile browser manufacturers because sites that weren't designed with media queries and with responsive design in mind are probably going to look terrible when rendered at 480 pixels or 320 pixels wide. But it does give us the problem that us nice responsible types who are making responsive designs with media queries are going to get something that looks a bit like the left-hand side here, and it's like, why have I got a terrible zoomed-out miniature version of my desktop website on my mobile? Of course, then we had this thing that came to the rescue, the viewport meta tag. And using this, you can say things like, don't render it at 1,000 pixels. Instead, render it at your true screen width so that you actually get things kicking in properly, like on the right-hand side here. So let's have a little bit of a look now at some other responsive design issues. There's quite a few other things to consider besides just the width of your screen. We'll look at some of these things as well. We need to think about responsive images, not just the width and height of your images, but the actual weight in kilobytes as well. Resolution is also becoming a big issue with so many high-resolution devices available, the Retina MacBooks and things like that. We also need to think about processing power and control mechanisms. So this is the basic problem with replaced elements in terms of constraining them inside their containers. We have the problem that by default, a replaced element such as an image will basically fill up as much space on the screen as its replaced content or the image file itself. So by default, it will just break out of the container if the layout gets to the point where the container is narrower than the actual image. This is fairly easy to fix. We can just basically say margin 0 auto and then max width 100% to make it so it sticks in the center of its container, and then it reduces to make sure it stays inside the container. Old IE versions don't support max width, which is one slight caveat to that, so you need to just use width as a fallback and be a bit careful about what images you apply it to, because you don't really want all of your images being 100% width of their container. You only want a few of them, so be a bit careful with that. But file size is also a very important thing. We don't want to give our users on mobile really massive files designed for the desktop layout. It's an assumption to think that narrow screen means mobile, means low resolution, means low bandwidth, but it's about the best we've got, these assumptions. And there's a few ways to deal with this. For background images, background CSS images, we can use the mobile first way of doing things. And this basically means that instead of having your desktop layout as your default layout before any media queries are used on the page, you should have your mobile layout as the default layout and then apply wider layouts for wider screens inside your media queries. So you're just doing it completely the opposite way round. And this is good because it means that you're only going to download your mobile background images in your default layout. The mobile phone is then not going to apply the stuff inside the media queries. So it means that you're not going to end up making the mobile phone download two sets of background images, the desktop background images and the mobile background images, which is what you'd do if you did it the other way around and had your desktop as the default layout. And then we've got this HTML5 video thing, and that's also pretty well served in this regard because inside the source elements on HTML5 video, you can use media queries inside the media attribute. So you can basically say, if the screen size is narrow, download this smaller video to play in the video player. If it's wide, download this larger video to play inside the video player instead. But HTML images are unfortunately out of luck because the image tag was invented years before responsive design was really an issue. So there have been a bunch of arguments and bits of work done to try and find a solution for this. We're still not really there yet. I'd say the best solution we have so far is adaptiveimages.com, written by a very clever guy from England called Matt Wilcox. And this is a good solution. It basically relies on you putting a bit of JavaScript in your page, which has the image inside it, that sets a cookie saying how wide the actual screen is. And then use an htaccess rule to say, if you serve an image file of some kind, don't let it be interpreted inside the HTML file that it's in by default, use this special PHP file instead. And then the PHP file then looks at how big the screen width is as recorded in the cookie. And if it says, oh, I think this screen's a bit too narrow for this very large image, it then uses GD to automatically resize the image for you. So it's quite an ingenious solution. It's not perfect. There are some problems in various setups, which I'm not going to go into now because it's too complicated, but there are various problems. But it's about the best we've got. It seems ludicrous to have to use server-side solutions to solve client-side problems, but there you go. And there's other ideas. The responsive images community group inside the W3C has come up with this picture element thing. And then Apple also invented this thing called SarkSet, which they both aim to give a similar kind of ability to images as the HTML5 video tag has with video. So we're not quite there yet, and this stuff is not in any spec yet, but it's being worked on. So just a little bit about processing power. For narrow screen devices, which will generally have lower CPU power than desktops, you might want to turn off things like shadows, gradients, and animations, because not only do they really clutter up the screen, but they also use quite a lot of processing power and can really slow things down. There is a bit of a hack where you can use 3D transitions that don't do anything to actually force certain mobile browsers to use hardware acceleration to display those transforms and transitions. So that's a bit of a hack you can use. Next up, we'll talk about resolution for a while. And I think this is an old VIC-20 or something. Can anybody guess what resolution we've got here? It's pretty pathetic. It's 64 by 48. Imagine if we had to do responsive designs for screens like that, how hilarious it would be these days. But these days, we have really high fidelity devices, things like 960 by 640 at 326 ppi. And these devices lie twice. Not only do they render sites too wide, but they also add a default zoom factor onto the resulting layout, just to make sure that it will actually look big enough after it's been rendered at this very high resolution. And it's all right for most content, but certain images can start to look really pixelated, because if you have a small image rendered on a high resolution device and then blown up, it can just start to look a bit crappy and pixelated. There are various ways around this. One quite simple solution is to just have an image that's a lot bigger than it actually needs to be, and then use the width attribute to scale it down to the actual size you want it to be. On a high resolution device, it will just follow the same rules as before, but because there's a lot more information available in the image, it still won't look too pixely and blurred. This might also be appropriate. You can use the resolution media query. Well, this is the old version. This is the min device pixel ratio media query, which is a proprietary Apple invention. You can use something like that to basically say, okay, when I've got a high resolution device accessing this page, use background size or something else to actually shrink the background image down. And that will give you a result like this. So the background image has been shrunk down, but at least that means that it's retained a bit more crispness and clarity. And there's another note, the min device pixel ratio media query is soon to be replaced by the resolution media query, which is the proper version inside the W3C spec. Another thing you can do also if you want to is inside the HTML viewport meta tag, there is the target density DPI content setting. And basically you can say target density DPI equals device DPI, and that basically says don't apply that zooming factor, actually show it at its real resolution, which is sometimes more helpful if you want to be a bit more in control of how your page is being rendered. And then just briefly to cover control mechanisms, because that's the other thing I mentioned. Really the usual wisdom about this applies. You should make sure that you should try and make your sites on mobile controllable by a variety of different mechanisms, keyboard accessible and things, because some devices will have keyboard controls. Touch is a bit of a difficult one. You can't detect that in CSS yet, but it is in CSS4 media queries, which I'll talk about later on. But you can detect touch using Modernizr, so at least there is a feasibility to be able to do that. So, moving swiftly on, because I don't have very much time left, now on to supporting older browsers. And by older browsers, we pretty much mean IE 6 to 8. Not all the time, but most of the time. So let's just have a little look at some things we can do. One big problem that immediately comes up is that old IE versions don't support media queries. Not really a surprise, because they don't really support much of anything, to be honest. Mobile first can be a bit of a problem, because if you've got the default layout inside your CSS before the media queries are applied as the mobile or narrow screen layout, your IE 6 to 8 browsers that come and render that web page will just have that as the layout, because they won't understand the media queries. And having a narrow screen layout on a desktop screen will obviously look terrible. So one thing that you can do is use a polyfill, such as respond.js, to fake support inside the old versions of IE. Or something that I more often than not do is I just use a conditional IE conditional comment to basically say, if the browser rendering the page is IE, just give it this fixed width style sheet that uses pixels instead of percentages and media queries. So that usually works. Let's face it, not many people are going to be using IE 6 on a mobile phone, so that's a fairly good way to do things. The other thing, though, that we can do, which I really love, is Modernizr. And this is really, really useful in terms of providing fallbacks for browsers that don't support things. Because I think thinking about browser support for older browsers and non-supporting browsers is also an important part of responsive design that people kind of overlook sometimes. So who here has used Modernizr on a project? Show of hands. So quite a few of you. So for those that haven't, the idea is that it's a JavaScript library that you attach to the page, and we also put this class of Node.js into our HTML tag. At runtime, it spits out all of these classes inside your HTML tag. And this is pretty damn cool, because it means that you can just have your normal set of CSS to do whatever you want to do in modern browsers, but then in older browsers that don't support the stuff you're using, you can do things like this. So here I'm using a descendant selector, using the class that's sat on the HTML tag to say, for browsers that don't support 3D transforms, just give them this alternative functionality that uses 2D transforms instead. In this particular case, I was just doing your typical flipping over card example. And in browsers that don't support the 3D transform that flips the card over, I just move the top of the card aside to show the bottom of the card instead. So it's not quite as elegant, but it still works on older browsers. Modernizr also provides a JavaScript API. So you can basically say things like this. So here I'm saying, if CSS animations are supported and 3D transforms are supported, run this code. If not, run this code instead. And again, I'm doing a similar thing here. I've basically got a card flip type example applied to a form. And when animations and transforms aren't supported, meaning that it can't do the flip over effect using the animation, it just increases the Z index of the back face instead. So it just appears not as elegant, but it still works. Another thing that's also coming in the future is the supports at rule. So this is another new CSS feature that's providing native feature detection inside the CSS language. It is a bit problematic at the moment, I'd say, because it's supported, I think, in Opera and WebKit, perhaps. Maybe Firefox has got it now, but it's a bit problematic when your feature support mechanism itself isn't supported, isn't it? But I mean, you can do things like say, okay, here's a basic layout, but then using supports, say, if this flex property is supported, then progressively enhance the site with a flexbox layout instead. But it still does rely on supports actually working, so probably best just to stick with Modernizr for now. So now let's have a little look at some of the other responsive modules that are available. We've looked at media queries a lot and such things, but there's a lot of other things you can do without using media queries. So the first thing we'll look at is CSS device adaptation. This basically does exactly the same thing as viewport. But basically somebody turned around one day from Opera and said, well, this viewport thing's really cool, but surely it's more of a CSS type thing than an HTML type thing. So we made a spec that allows you to do the same stuff that you can do in the viewport meta tag inside the CSS viewport at rule. This is supported in the old Opera Presto rendering engine, IE10, and it's going to be coming into WebKit very soon. And again, it's nothing different, but it just makes a bit more sense. The other thing that's kind of cool is that you can nest your viewport at rule inside your media queries. So you can basically say, okay, I only want this viewport to happen if this media query kicks off, which is quite useful in some situations. Next, let's talk about Flexbox. Everybody loves Flexbox. This is the sexiest new spec we've got, pretty much. Well, sexy as specs go. And the idea we've got of Flexbox is it fixes a lot of the really stupid layout stuff that we've had to do for many, many years. You know, how hard it is to do basic things like centering stuff vertically and having equal height columns when there's different content in the different columns. And how about reordering the layout order of your elements without messing with the DOM and incurring loads of expensive crap inside DOM scripting? This is supported in its newest syntax incarnation, which is the final one now. It really, really shouldn't change anymore, I've been promised, in Opera and WebKit, and it's also just about there in Firefox. And then there's an older legacy Flexbox syntax from 2009 that's supported in Safari, older Firefox and WebKit, and IE10. Well, IE10 supports a weird hybrid, but there you go. So using Modernizr, you can basically get Flexbox to work across a lot of different browsers right now, so it's fairly usable, I would say. But the idea is this. So we've got simple example here. We've just got a section with 3 articles inside it. By default, this will give you something like this. But then what we can do is we can say, okay, we want it to be laid out as a row, so FlexFlow row. And that immediately makes it do this. And it's like, well, that's pretty cool, isn't it? We've already got same height columns. Well, there's the same amount of content in each one, but if there was different amounts of content in each one, it would still have same height columns, which is one problem. And it's also making it so that they all take up the same proportion of space inside the parent element. And then we can do things like this. So if we give our section and our articles a height, we can say align items in the center. So basically it will align them vertically in the very center. That kind of thing is very hard to do with conventional CSS. And then we can also do this. We can put the Flexbox items in different ordinal groups. And the idea here is you basically say, okay, by default, they're all in ordinal group 0. But if we put the first and third in ordinal group 2 and the second in ordinal group 1, the second one will now appear first. It will still be in exactly the same order in the source, but it will just be changed using CSS in terms of the final display order, which is very, very useful in certain situations. For example, when you're doing responsive design, you quite often want to grab your menu, which is up the top of the screen, and stick it down the bottom of the screen on mobile sites. There's a lot of mobile sites that do that. And that's a bit of a pain to do at the moment without using horrible CSS tables hacks. But with Flexbox, you could do it really easily. But really, the best trick that Flexbox has available is this. You've got this flex property. And the way this works is it says all of the elements that are laid out inside the Flexbox, if they've all got flex 1, they will take up an equal amount of the space available in the parent. So you'll get something like this, which is actually the default. That's how it's laid out by default. But if you then said, OK, I want to give my third child element flex 2, this would then take up twice as much space, twice as much of the space left in the parent element after things like padding, etc., have been taken off. So that is really, really useful. I'll now, speeding up a bit because I'm really running out of time, we'll now look at multicol briefly. So multicol is another spec, and this basically allows you to say, I've got this content, and I want to just break it up into 3 columns. And then if the actual element that has the contents, has the columns inside it, changes width, the content will just reflow nicely between the columns. You know, it's really flexible and interesting and useful. You can even do interesting responsive things like this. You can say column width 20 ems, and then my columns will always be about 20 ems wide. It uses a kind of a best fit approach. So the browser sort of says, okay, well, I can fit 3 columns inside the space I've got available. If I just increase the size slightly, and then I'll have no gap left at the end. So sort of best fit approach. But then as the screen width decreases, the number of columns will then decrease to fit the amount of space available. This is supported in pretty much all modern browsers, although the implementation in Chrome and Firefox is not so good. Actually, since Opera moved to WebKit, this was actually our first patch into the WebKit project, was improving the multi-column support to the level that we used to have it in Presto. So we've reached pretty much the end now, so I'll just briefly finish off with some future developments. Most people have heard of media queries, but not many people have heard of MATCHMEDIA. And the idea of MATCHMEDIA is you can basically run a media query inside JavaScript. So here I'm just basically saying, if this media query matches, do stuff for wider screens, but if not, do stuff for narrow screens. So just standard conditionals, but using media queries to work out whether to do one thing or the other. And that works in everything except IE below 10 and Opera Presto, but you can polyfill it, so it's okay. In CSS4 media queries, we're going to start having things like the script media query, so you can basically detect if script is available or not and change your layout accordingly. There's going to be a hover media feature to basically say, you know, is hovering available in the output device or not? That's also quite important with some of the weird behaviors you get with mobile phones and hovering, especially with touch screens. There's also going to be a pointer media query. And the idea here is it basically says, you know, is there no pointer available? Is there a big coarse pointer available, like, you know, your big fat finger? Or is there a fine pointer available, like a stylus on a 3DS or something? So this is going to be quite useful because it's basically going to allow you to change the size of input elements depending on how coarse and inaccurate the pointer is. There's also recently been added a luminosity media query to CSS4 media queries that says, you know, is the device being viewed in a dim environment, or is it really, really washed out? Is it in bright sunlight, or is it just normal? So again, that's useful for changing layouts to suit different brightness conditions. And then there's a lot of other ideas that haven't even made it into the spec yet. So things like, is the device paged? Is it interactive? Is it a touchscreen device? You know, has it got a keyboard? That's another one that's going to be quite interesting. Has it got a remote? So, you know, is it like a web TV, or is it like a Wii, for example? So things like that are going to be very useful. Then the holy grail is really a network speed media query. This is one that people have argued about for ages, trying to work out the best way to do it. So far, there haven't really been that many good thoughts on it, because there's problems like, you know, if you walk into an area and initially the network speed is very bad or very good, there's nothing to say that it won't change if you walk a bit further. So, you know, what happens? Do you keep relentlessly, you know, polling the network all the time? It's difficult to work out the best way to spec this. If you have any ideas, please get in touch with the CSS working group about it. So to round off, a very, very subtle advertisement there. I have got a book which explains a lot of this stuff in a lot more detail, so please buy it, or at least bug me for a free e-copy. I don't care, really. And that's pretty much the end of the talk, so thank you very much for listening.
Codemotion.